Good afternoon. I'm Robert Pondiscio with the American Enterprise Institute, and welcome to our ongoing series of webinars on practice-based issues. Today's webinar owes its existence to the Research Ed conference last April in Greenwich, Connecticut. If you've never heard of Research Ed, let's fix that right now. It's a grassroots movement and conference series that started in the UK several years ago that aims to bridge the gap between education, research, and classroom practice. Research Ed brings together teachers, researchers, and policymakers to discuss evidence-based approaches, share insights, and improve teaching and learning outcomes. I've attended Research Ed events in 3 different countries so far. Last April was the first time I'd heard Dr. Zach Groshell speak. He delivered a terrific talk on reviving the lost art of direct and explicit instruction. I was so captivated by Zach's talk that I resolved on the spot to invite him to participate in our ongoing series of webinars on classroom practice. Now, for those who've attended one of these AEI webinars in the past, we're going to try a different format this time. Instead of our standard panel discussion, we're going to turn the proceedings over to Zach for his presentation, mostly the same one that I saw last April in Greenwich. And then we're going to turn to a pair of discussants, Kurt Engelmann and Patrice Bain, for their thoughts in response to Zach's talk. And then in the remaining time, then we'll open it up for our traditional discussion. So let's introduce who you'll meet today. Zach Groshell is a highly distinguished teacher, instructional coach, and education consultant. He's based in Seattle, Washington. Zach works with schools nationwide and internationally to develop high-quality instruction based on the science of how kids learn. Zach hosts the podcast Progressively Incorrect, and he's active on Twitter and his blog, Education Rickshaw. Patrice Bain is a K-12 and college-level educator and speaker. She's the co-author of the U.S. Department of Education's guide, Organizing Instruction and Study to Improve Student Learning and Powerful Teaching, Unleash the Science of Learning. She's the author of A Parent's Guide to Powerful Teaching and the forthcoming Powerful Classrooms, Evidence-Informed Strategies and Resources. Patrice was the Illinois Teacher of the Year finalist, a Fulbright Scholar in Europe, and has been featured in international podcasts, webinars, presentations, and popular media outlets. Bain contributed to the United Nations UNESCO International Science and Evidence-Based Education Assessment, outlining a vision for world education by 2030. And Kurt Engelmann is president and board member of the National Institute for Direct Instruction, NIFTY. He began his career in education in the early 1980s as a tutor working with a variety of learning disabled students. He's led NIFTY as president and administrative director since July of 2000. Under his direction, NIFTY has implemented the DI model in elementary schools and middle schools, serving highly at-risk populations in a variety of settings, including rural, urban, and international settings. Kurt is the author of Direct Instruction, a Practitioner's Handbook, which was published by John Catt, Hodder Education, just a few weeks ago in 2024. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zach for his talk. Thank you again for joining us. And Zach, take it away.
Thank you, Robert. This is exciting. We are going to be talking about explicit instruction and direct instruction. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm liking this new format that you guys have going because it's going to allow me to kind of break down some concepts here that I think teachers and parents, policymakers all need to be familiar with. And it's also going to describe my journey as a teacher. As you said earlier, I started as an elementary teacher. I went for 10 years teaching, and then I got into instructional coaching, and I'm working with schools around the world trying to embed some of these ideas so that students can feel successful, parents can see their kids' growth. Just a quick plug for a book coming out that I just wrote called Just Tell Them, which very much is this presentation turned into a book full of research and practical insights into explicit instruction, and in particular focusing on modeling, how to model the material better so that even the most complex concepts can be understood by some of our most vulnerable learners. Now, I've put up an image here, and a black and white type of classroom with the teacher standing at the front. there's even a dunce cap in there, right? We may as well bolt down the desks to the floor, and and talk about how these children are learning by rote, right? It's sort of a caricature that I've put up here of the teacher controlling the learning and the students sitting passively. This was sort of the optics, the imagery that I started off my teacher prep program learning about. This was sort of in the air that we breathed. That the teacher leading the learning was bad. Students leading the learning was good. Maybe you've heard some of these things. I'll just put that on the screen. He who does the talking does the learning, they told me. Better to be a guide on the side than a sage on the stage. And of course, the one of the one of those cringeworthy ones, I guess I'll leave to the end, is that I don't teach students; they teach me. Right? These all sort of speak to a vision for learning that is that the child is basically in control of pursuing their interests, their passions, and anything less is going to be too boring. It's going to disengage children, and it's going to lead to maybe artificial learning. It's not going to lead to real learning. I've also seen this. I just put up a blurry meme because I see this thing so much online. The same things, some of the same optics, right? Comparing traditional schooling to a prison simply because schools have hallways and doors. And really trying to break free of a traditional model of education in which the teacher is the expert and the teacher leads the learning. I am not somebody who is a contrarian by nature, and so I actually I took these words to heart when I first started teaching. I listened to my professors who, ironically, were telling me to get off the stage and be a guide on the side while they were presenting on a literal stage, right? While they were at the front, they were telling me this. But these are some pictures of my classroom in the beginning years. They're really beautiful images of kids, doing really fantastic things. But hidden behind this, these pictures, which are sort of great for brochures and maybe advertising for your school, hidden behind these were some things that maybe my evaluators didn't see. I have an example here of a real project that one of my students did. You look at it and you think, well, that's great. She did a friendship bracelet. Maybe all kids deserve a little art time now and then. But the real story behind this was that the school had mandated that 20% of all instructional time be dedicated to passion projects like this. And this is the entire student's output after 20% of their time was used after 6 months of this type of scheme. The student herself actually only got to this point because me and other people had to cajole her and pressure her and reprimand her eventually to get anything done. She couldn't read at grade level. Her math scores were very remedial, and we were having her sit in her own thoughts and to put together this project, a project that my daughter could probably finish in about 15 minutes at age 5. This is the kind of thing that really gets me passionate and worked up. This idea of how can we best use time in our classrooms using the best evidence instructional methods that we know of in order to give kids the best opportunities that they have so that they can go and pursue their dreams and they can be creative and critical thinkers. Clearly, my teaching at the beginning wasn't doing that. And it started to make me think, like, what is the evidence behind great teaching? Like, what do we know about effective teaching practices? And I started a PhD, in pursuit of learning this. It was something that was withheld from me in my teacher school, and my school itself was doing all sorts of weird professional development that didn't help me at all. So I got into this myself, and I kind of became a research nerd, right? One of the first things that comes up, and we'll talk about some evidence here, was the largest and most extensive, possibly the most expensive research study that's ever been conducted. That's called Project Follow Through. And what makes Project Follow Through so important is not only is it very long, a longitudinal type of study, not only was it expensive and a lot of investment was put into it, but what it was it had researchers do something that they typically don't do, which is compete with each other in order to see which philosophy or approach or model would be the most effective. So the direct instruction people could come out and try their model, and the inquiry and discovery learning type folks could try out their models. And because we're all playing by the same rules and using the same assessments, we can find that we can learn something. What is the most effective approach? Um, Looking at this slide, right, you know that it's the 9 models that I'm going to show you are going to populate the screen. It was mostly focused on K through 3 students in reading and math. Maybe you make a prediction. I think a lot of people, when this study came out, thought maybe the inquiry folks would be good at the kind of problem solving and critical thinking. There was another form of a model which was around self-esteem at the time, and they thought maybe the self-esteem programs will help kids get better at self-esteem, while direct instruction will probably just be good at teaching basic facts, basic kind of rote knowledge is I think what a lot of people thought was going to happen. I'll put up the results. And so what you see on your screen here is a graph that's circulated now more and more widely. And if you look on the left, you can see the results of direct instruction. It was a program that still exists today. The materials are ones that I personally have taught with and have been trained from the National Institute for Direct Instruction. And it blew all these other models away, as you can see. And it blew them away not just in the basic academic skills, that's the blue, the dark blue, but in the problem-solving skills that people typically associated at the time and still today with more of that kind of open-ended type of education, the kind of discovery, let the child lead the learning. It beat them there too. And the explanation is pretty clear to me now. The kids learned basic foundational knowledge that they were able to use in problem-solving tasks, and that helped them outperform the other models. The red bar you see there is self-esteem. And I think a lot of people at the time might have thought direct instruction kills self-esteem or makes kids feel worse about themselves, when in fact, it outperformed all of the other models. Some of these models you can see have a downward trend from that middle line. This basically suggests that some of the models that schools chose to use, it would have been better had they not entered into this research and used those models. If they had just basically stuck to business as usual learning, they might have been better off. A lot of teachers, when I present this diagram, are in shock. When I go around the country and I go to different schools, and they just wonder why they've never heard of this study when it's such a big deal. It's almost like not knowing about the moon landing, right? And one of those kind of big, extensive research studies that everyone should know about. I also started to kind of poke around and learn about the actions of the most effective teachers. And what they would do in this kind of research is they would study a grade level of math teachers, for example, and they would figure out basically what are the moves, what are the techniques that the teachers use, and which of those is correlated with higher achievement, with achievement gains, right? So, for example, if a teacher sits a lot, it's often associated with lower achievement gains. Well, what do the teachers do that's associated with positive, with higher growth? And they came up with this list. I'll put it on your screen for a second. And what they learned was a pattern of a teacher providing models, guiding student practice, having lots of review, checking for understanding. These might feel like bread and butter type of moves, and that's what they are, right? They're not especially innovative sounding. They're not sexy, for lack of a better word. They're the basic foundational skills of great teaching. And they called this pattern, at first they called it, several different names, but one of the main names they called it was direct instruction, lowercase d, lowercase I, to distinguish this pattern from the really successful capital D, capital I programs that were successful in Project Follow Through. Now, that Project Follow Through study on direct instruction, the delivery, especially the delivery moves of those programs, fit perfectly well with this pattern. There's no conflict between the two. The main difference is that the capital DI programs were programs. They consisted of teacher materials. They consisted of an instructional designer who created curriculum materials for the teachers. So this maybe is more of the what, where DI is both the what and the how for teachers, but no conflict at all in terms of the methods. And finally, one of the last things I learned about as I was sort of changing over to the dark side, right, to direct instruction from a more inquiry kind of discovery method, was this paper titled "Why Minimal Guidance During Instruction Does Not Work." The failure, an analysis of the failure of constructivist discovery, problem-based, experiential, and inquiry-based teaching. And in this, the authors write a scathing review of methods that have been shown over and over again in cycles to not work, that are basically based on the premise that students can lead their own learning and figure things out for themselves. And they found through, by looking specifically at cognitive science research, that these methods often harm learning. Just like we saw with the two other areas of evidence, they do not benefit kids compared to direct instructional guidance. And they explain it with a model that I think every teacher needs to know. Every child is armed with this component of their cognition called working memory, and that buffer, that zone, is like a bottleneck. It is very, right now I'm talking to you and I'm funneling things into your working memory and you're having to think about it and deal with it. Well, these discovery-based approaches, what they do is they essentially have kids thinking about all the wrong things. They're trying to figure out the problem rather than learning how something works from someone who can break it down for them. It's having kids think about what Billy is doing under the table. It's having them think about the noise in the classroom and just the amount of extraneous cognitive load that these type of methods impose on students. The authors argued that essentially this type of teaching doesn't comply with how the mind learns and processes information. Because ultimately the goal of teaching is for students to acquire this knowledge in their long-term memory. And if working memory is overloaded by, for example, a problem that they do not know how to solve, giving them that problem and having them struggle and beat their heads over their tables trying to figure this out without guidance, without models, without demonstrations, without feedback, it's a recipe for minimal learning. So you basically, the student gets overloaded, thought breaks down, and that expresses itself in so many ways. Kids giving up. And this is what happened in my classroom. Kids were giving up on their learning. They were struggling to make sense of it when their peers maybe already knew the information from after school tutoring or their parents showing it to them during homework. And we created a divide between kids who somehow discovered it and the kids who just simply didn't discover it. And the research bears this out. Just, for example, when we run an experiment like this, we give some students a problem that they are unable to solve and see how well they do. And we give the second group models. We give them usually models and problems so that they can read a model, learn from it, and do something with it. Like in an alternating fashion is how this research works. And typically, what do we see? We see that when we give students the models, when we directly explain the math or the content step by step, starting with the problem and moving down to the answer, that the learning is much more efficient. Kids learn this stuff. They pick it up much quicker when we teach it to them. And it's also much more effective. They retain it longer. They can show their learning on a delayed test, right? And more research is appearing to support the idea that giving students models like this, actually directly teaching them, it lowers their anxiety, which totally makes sense when we think back to project follow through. The kids felt more had higher self-esteem when they were successful, and giving students lots of problems in order to try to figure out, withholding guidance is a recipe for them not learning the material. Are you liking this, Robert? Everything good?
I'm going to unmute myself for a second, Zach, just to weigh in. I'm having a flashback here because so much of this is intuitive. And what I'm wondering to myself is, how did we decide as teachers that teaching was bad?
Yeah, right. And I have so many different theories, right? But this goes back to, this is a long tradition of which it's documented in so many good books. Tom Lovelace has done stuff on this. Diane Ravage's Left Back explains the history of this. But a lot of times people say that what's on your slide right now, isn't this common sense? Like, think about the swimming pool. We start when they're non-swimmers on the wall, and the teacher actually teaches them and slowly, holds your belly and doesn't let you, flounder in the water, right? And it just doesn't make any sense to, the other side of this, right? Having, throwing kids into the deep end and having them struggle. Like, isn't this common sense? Um, it certainly is now to me, and I think a lot of teachers feel refreshed to hear that what they came upon on their own with little help from their college prep programs often, uh, that it does have an evidence base. And it's kind of nice to think that the things teachers discovered on their own through their own discovery could is the most effective route forward, because it's intuitive, it's common sense, and yet we kind of try to go against that common sense, I think, sometimes, in order to be more, to try to appear more innovative, or to try to appeal to sort of a child-centered philosophy that really doesn't doesn't work in terms of how the mind works. I'm going to put on your screen now. So, like, you're probably asking, okay, cool, right? Well, can you dive in deeper into the components then? The actual, what are you talking about when you say direct and explicit instruction? The rest of my talk here is all about the components of, like, what are the actual techniques? What are the strands, the must-haves of direct instruction? I'll put it on your screen, and I want you to go ahead and read that. And now we'll go through some of the insights. So one of the things I think is most obvious in when people talk about direct and explicit instruction is that the teacher's presentation should be clear and unambiguous, right? It is not trying to create confusion unnecessarily or engineer struggle for kids. Kids struggle enough at school. Some of our kids do not need us to make it harder for them. So what it is about making learning feel easy. And all of our best teachers, if we look back at our own, like, learning histories, we remember that teacher who could just explain things so that we felt smart, right? And that's the first principle here. In the research, we see things like this text, which has all types of unnecessary verbiage in here. And when we compare it to a presentation in which all of the vague or mazy, discontinuous language is taken out, the students are more satisfied with the presentation. They learn more. Their cognitive load is measured as being lower, right? So starting with just saying the words that need to be said. And one of the things, before I keep going, one of the things that's great about, for example, using a program like direct instruction is that the teacher presentations are already limited to just what you need to say, right? They provide the scripts, they provide the language, and oftentimes it's 2 sentences. It's a minimal statement of just the teacher gets in and says just what they need to say, as opposed to that, like, long-winded lecture that some people associate with direct and explicit instruction. It's not that. It's very much a minimized teacher presentation saying only what needs to be said. It also, we can think to the research around speaking only, right? A lot of the best explanations include pairing the speaking instead with visuals, right? This teacher's talking about a bike pump. When the handle is pushed up, the piston moves up, the inlet valve closes, the outlet valve opens, and air moves out through the hose. Really tough to process that as a kid. You have to have some sort of permanent, concrete representation of it to pair your words with what they're saying. So great explicit teaching pairs images with talking in a complementary fashion. And of course, right, speaking with visuals is great, but if you pair it with visuals that are unnecessary, like a dancing dog GIF or GIF, or you have just a bunch of decorative images, those don't tend to help learning. It creates incoherence in the presentation. Important when you're speaking with visuals too, to ensure that you're not creating lots of just having excessive amounts of text on the board, especially text that just duplicates what you're saying. Students looking on the left are probably going to read what you're saying, and instead of listening to you, then they're going to switch back and forth, and there's going to be a penalty. And I'm listening to you, I'm reading this. Some students extract some of the knowledge, and others extract a different subset of that knowledge. Better to just talk over a very minimalist slide while you're presenting. Um, it, it's also been shown that teachers really need to point to what they're what they're talking about. Be there front and center. Instructors visible, right? Not in the back, kind of moving back and forth, right? Or an unsignaled presentation where they're not really signaling and funneling just a little bit of information into working memory at a time has been found. And another piece of explaining clearly is that while this diagram I've been using is great, there's been some recent developments talking about drawing out what you're saying as you go, sort of starting with a blank canvas and adding to the board, right? The teacher then can just put a small amount of information on the board so that all students only have to process just that information. Maybe the whole diagram is presenting too much at once, and the students are going to be overwhelmed, right? That's talking about explaining clearly, but let's keep going through these components, the practical pieces. What about modeling in small steps? I'm going to put a text up on the board that is meant to overload your working memory. Now, what I've put on the board is only understandable to someone who's an expert, I suppose, in convolutional neural networks. But this is what a lot of students experience when they don't have the prior knowledge to understand what we're talking about. It's often this is the feeling of discovery learning. They're trying to do a big old project that includes so many different elements they don't know anything about, and they get overloaded. Extended lecturing in the lecture hall of a university is just not good teaching. It's not explicit teaching. The main reason has to do with cognitive overload. When you're working with students with a direct and explicit approach to teaching, you're really going to alternate. The teacher is going to say a little bit and then turn it over to the student to check that they understood it, to check that they hear it. When I work with teachers, I show a lot of video and I give a lot of examples and have them rehearse and practice with each other, like in simulations, these 5 techniques using choral response when everybody responds. I say, what's the capital of Sudan? Everyone says Khartoum on a snap or on a tap of my finger, or using cold calling to choose non-volunteers to get everyone involved. More and more, I've been working with schools to develop their practices around like mini whiteboards. Every student shows their answer. That way, the teacher can check that they are presenting information that's landing, right? And all the students are engaged. They are active. They are thinking about what the teacher is saying, not just perceiving it, right? Not just experiencing it. And when we talk about when I talk to teachers too, we get really specific about what it means to ask good questions to kids. If I just say, Laura, what's the capital of Sudan? Laura's name is said first. Everyone's going to tune out except for Laura, because they know they're not going to be picked. They know Laura is already going to have to answer the question. A little bit better would be to go, what's the capital of Sudan, Laura? Because then at least the fastest kids could pick up on the question before I said Laura's name and everyone else tunes out, right? Even better would be to, when you ask your question, to go, what's the capital of Sudan? I pause, I scan the room, I look, and then I go, Laura. And now Laura gets the answer, but at least everyone else mentally rehearsed the question. Or, goodness, best of all, what's the capital of Sudan? And I snap my fingers, and everyone responds chorally, Khartoum. Everyone gets the answer. I've maximized thinking in my classroom, or I get everyone to do this with a mini whiteboard. What's the capital of Sudan? 3, 2, 1, show me. Everybody says Khartoum, Sudan. So really, explicit instruction is a mode that requires a lot of interactive elements, bouncing around questions, checking for for understanding, making sure everybody responds. And then we use those responses to adjust and augment our teaching. It's our formative assessment. This is completely contrary to what people say when they denigrate direct and explicit instruction, is that it's a passive mode of learning. It's in fact the most interactive form of teaching there is, but the teacher is orchestrating it. The teacher is regulating the information. I'm going to go into examples and non-examples. One thing I really love about direct instruction, the capital DI, is this example of the teacher standing in front of their students and waving a green cloth over their head and saying, "This is GLERM." It's an example from DI to show that a single example like this can lead to many different interpretations. The students can infer from just this waving the green cloth that the teacher's talking about green, is talking about waving, the verb, is talking about cloth. Maybe they even think it means surrender. I don't know, right? Waving the cloth over your head. All the kids can come up with different interpretations. The only way to really teach this well is not to have them go discover it, but it's to delineate the boundaries of the concept through loads of examples and non-examples. And right, you can think of this when you're teaching math, like when you're teaching symmetry. This is a line of symmetry. That's insufficient because I did this with my third graders. And guess what they all did? They all drew a vertical dotted line down every shape on their paper. I needed to teach the whole concept. So holding the pentagon constant, I draw a line that is just minimally different than the previous one. And then just like that, students can see, oh, that's where a line of symmetry is no longer correctly drawn. And I can keep on going, and this is not a line of symmetry, and this is a line of symmetry, keeping the wording the same, keeping the shape constant, and just slowly showing examples. This doesn't just apply to symmetry, it applies to everything we teach, but really going around the boundaries of the concept with the students, for the students. And finally, you're really going to test the students. You're going to give them examples that they've never seen before, and you're going to be checking that they do understand the concept fully, not just a simple, even you could call it a rote understanding of just a very inflexible understanding of the material. I mean, we can give examples and non-examples now of explicit and direct instruction. Examples are the teacher anticipates errors by pre-teaching the concepts, wherein a non-example would be the teacher takes a wait and see approach, reacting, right? In explicit and direct instruction, the teacher is going to fully explain concepts, while in a non-example of explicit instruction is the teacher just sort of withholding information, giving hints, little probing questions, and so on. I'll populate the rest of the screen. That last part is interesting. It goes into what we're going to talk about next, which is that in explicit instruction, we can go and do the projects. We can do the Socratic seminars. We can do things that are more of a rich task, but only after the students have received the foundational skills that they need to fluency. What teaching is not, is that the entirety of the lesson is around these projects. It's not based in a project, but a project may be used to consolidate what has been learned. How are we doing on time, Robert?
I could listen to this all day, Zach, but keep going for another couple of minutes, and then we'll introduce Patrice and Kurt.
Perfect. I I'm gonna the next one is around practice. I'm gonna play a very short clip.
Enfin. میتونیام فقط هوا کنیم باشه باشه اوکی برو
So the core of direct and explicit instruction is really that students get sufficient practice. So much teaching these days does not give kids enough opportunities to make this stuff permanent. Practice makes perfect. Practice makes permanent. So some of the things that we're learning from cognitive science research that Patrice will talk about in just a moment is the benefit of quizzing students, right? Giving them lots of practice to retrieve from memory using do nows, flashcards, brain dumps. I think Patrice is the best person in this call to talk about these things. But we're learning more and more that teaching is not just about putting information in, but also about pulling it out through loads of practice. And this makes sense when we think about the forgetting curve, right? That learning needs to really be stretched out over time with lots of repetition, right? Direct and explicit instruction gives repetition, but not just all at once, but spaced out. So when you're teaching, you might think about your unit and how conventional teaching often just masses the units like this. But really, we should be doing more of something like this, where the teaching, every unit requires students to retrieve or recall knowledge from previous units in a really mixed in fashion. This is why I'm just such a big fan of direct instruction, because like this right here, the scope and sequence for connecting math concepts, it shows, if you look at the lessons, like at the top, it shows lesson 45, for example, right towards the middle. That same lesson will touch upon different, it will touch on counting, it will touch on place value, it will touch on number families. The same lesson is going to weave things together in a way that requires students to constantly be retrieving and practicing. This is the instructional design. And I love this quote, really, thinking just about how how we as teachers are constantly having to make up our own materials. This is complex stuff. Marcy Steiner has this quote: "Even if teachers were taught about instructional design, they would likely not have the time to prepare instructional materials, field test those materials to determine if they are effective, and modify the materials before using them to teach students. An iterative process is crucial for the development of effective materials." I'll just leave you with thinking, like, is this something that all teachers have the expertise to do, or that they even should be wasting, in my opinion, their time doing, when we could do this in a much more systematic way with the instructional designer making a lot of those decisions on behalf of the teacher. Finally, and I'll go quickly through this, the whole point of explicit instruction is really to get students to master the material, to think critically, to do all the cool things that the folks that I showed you at the beginning who love this discovery and inquiry, they prioritize that, but they're having students spend all their time struggling through it as opposed to teaching it to them. And so we have the metaphor of scaffolding that teachers know, but we don't start at the roof of a house when we build it. We start at the foundation. And we essentially think of students existing on a continuum, and we teach them at first, and we slowly fade out the supports so that students can do this stuff independently with loads of practice. It's essentially a handoff. The teacher is going to structure the learning so that kids can be successful. And success feels so good. It feels great to be in school and to be alive when your teacher sets things up for you so that you can feel smart. And so here's the bottom line, and we'll go to the panel. This is the argument that I've been making for a while, and I hope that you take this to your staff and you bring this to them as well. There are significant disparities between students with resources and those without. For some kids, learning is especially challenging. Breaking down the material so that learning feels easy is beneficial to all, harmful to none, and crucial for some. To maximize opportunities for our kids, we need to teach more efficiently and effectively. And our best bet is through direct and explicit instruction. Thank you so much for listening, everybody.
Bravo, Zach. Well done. I'm reminded years and years ago when I was teaching at PS 277 in the South Bronx and struggling with literacy instruction with my students. I had the occasion and questioning, Zach, like the way you traced your journey. I had a similar journey with literacy instruction. And I remember sitting through a demonstration by Dan Willingham, the cognitive scientist at the University of Virginia, and the title was "Teaching Content is Teaching Reading." And I remember quite literally bouncing in my seat in the auditorium, repeating to myself over and over, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it." In other words, there were so many of the things that he talked about that I'd kind of intuited, or the way I was taught to teach reading to my students just seemed just off. And I suspect we can't see them, but I suspect among our listeners right now, there are a lot of folks listening to your presentation, bouncing in their seats at home saying, "I knew it, I knew it." Really refreshing and well done. Thank you very much, Zach. Let's go to our two respondents now. Patrice Bain, you have spent more than 25 years in the classroom. Could you speak briefly to the value of direct instruction and its impact on student learning? What have you seen from your experience? What are some of the strengths of direct instruction that you'd like to highlight for our audience?
Thank you. Zach, great job. I totally agree with everything you said. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. So many of the things that you were right on target with, Zach. For one thing, keeping it simple. Going back to Dan Willingham, he has a great quote that is, "Memory is the residue of thought." And so when we get in front of our students and have these outrageous stories that we love and putting in all this information, what is it they're really going to remember? The basic facts or some wild story that was told? So I think as teachers, understanding how important direct instruction is and to keep it simple. And as Zach talked about working memory, we also need to be cognizant of the room. We need to make sure that not only in direct instruction are we keeping it simple, but we need to keep our classroom simple too. So when we are trying to, even if we are, making very short, simple, just what they need to know, if the room is filled with so many things, that also affects a student's memory. Zach talked about study between Roediger and Karpicki. This study was actually done at a college campus in laboratories with college students reading a passage about sea otters. Well, Roediger and Mark McDaniel were cognitive scientists that wanted to study how do students learn in an authentic classroom. And it was mine that they came to. And we actually replicated that study to see, yeah, it worked great with college students and reading about otters, but it also worked great with 11-year-olds learning world history. And part of this is the direct instruction, but we can't just stop there. And Zach talked a little bit about the retrieval, the spacing, the interleaving, and also metacognition, helping students understand when they know something and when it needs further work. In my book, Powerful Teaching, we call those power tools because with the 15 years I worked with cognitive scientists, it was very clear that those create powerful learning. So I think we can't just stop with direct instruction, but we need to go hand in hand with how cognitive science can really, really play a role in there.
Kurt Engelmann, Zach alluded to this briefly in his talk, but I want to make sure that we're addressing it unambiguously. I think he referred to capital DI direct instruction and lowercase DI direct instruction, and those are not the same thing. So indulge me for a moment, and let's assume that we need to unpack those terms so folks are clear. Could you walk us through the differences between what we are using as shorthand, capital DI and small DI? And what those differences look like in practice?
I'd be glad to, Robert. Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you, Patrice and Zach. Patrice and Zach. And Zach, thanks so much for that overview presentation. There was so much there that could actually be and is in upper level college courses and books like The Theory of Instruction. It's tremendous content. Yeah, Zach did hit on the central difference between small or lowercase di and uppercase di, and that is that there are published programs that incorporate all of those techniques, all those design aspects that he talked about with regard to effective teaching. And the first of these was published in 1969 through 1970, the DISTAR, Direct Instruction Systems for Teaching and remediation. And now there are programs that go up through Essentials for Algebra and Essentials for Writing at the 10th grade level. All of these programs have what's called the incremental step design. And that was one of the things, Zach, you mentioned of new material in small steps. And it's actually a very difficult thing for teachers to do on their own over a series of times. All of these programs have 10 to 15% new. That's all in a lesson. The rest of the lesson is 85 to 90% review of material that was introduced previously, concepts and skills, or application of those skills. So that really promotes moving things into long-term memory. It promotes automaticity. And if kids are placed correctly in the programs and taught to mastery, then the next day's lesson they'll only have 10 to 15% new again and 10 to 15% new. So if they're taught to mastery every day, they will go through and master all of the content. Zach talked about the strand or track system in which there are groups of exercises that span many different lessons. And an example in beginning reading is that in the same lesson, you may have short exercises on symbol identification or oral blending, rhyming, sounding out words, etc. And when they're up to it, story reading. And those tracks will become more sophisticated over time, and they'll merge with each other to make sure that the students are learning. Placement in the program is super important. And all the programs come with placement tests. So students are placed not at their grade level, but at their skill level as demonstrated in the placement tests. And the different levels will have different entry points. And the goal is to have homogeneous groups, groups as homogeneous as possible, which really facilitates the teaching. These groups are generally small in the lower levels of the programs, a maximum of 4 or 12 students. But once they get into the upper levels of the program, then it can be whole class. Still homogeneous, but whole class. And having cross-class or cross-grade grouping really helps facilitate that grouping. Teaching to mastery is essential, and many of the programs are called reading mastery, spelling mastery. They incorporate the name mastery into them. The goal is that all of the students are engaged 100% of the time, and they all master 100% of the content by the end of every single lesson. And so all errors are corrected. And the independent work is closely tied to the content they learned in today's lesson or previous lessons. And there are in-program assessments like mastery tests that occur usually about every 10 lessons. And those both have very high passing criteria. So students need to get at least 85% correct on independent work for that to be considered passing. And it's 90% on the mastery test. I know I'm drilling into the weeds here, but I just want you to see the high levels of mastery that are expected and attainable. And there is targeted teaching that the program stipulates for every type of error that they make, either in independent work or in the mastery test. So they get that delayed retrieval practice. Now, as Zach talked about, there is a script. The programs are completely scripted. It scripts what the teachers say, what type of signals to use, because it's choral responses for group work followed by individual turns, what the expected student responses are, and what the error corrections are, so that teachers have at their fingertips all the details of that powerful teaching, which means that they can concentrate much more on the students. These scripts and the whole programs have been field tested and revised based on the field tryouts. So the Just Our Reading program, which became Reading Mastery Signature Edition, that program was completely scrapped and rewritten 3 times based on the tryouts until it was demonstrated that it works for all students who meet the entrance criteria. So that's the definition of high quality instructional materials, verified that they work. And the last thing I'll say about capital DI is that there is a comprehensive implementation model, a school-wide model, which NIFTI, the National Institute for Direct Instruction, supports. So that involves using the DI programs for core instruction in reading, language, spelling, mathematics, all the way up through the elementary schools. And then there's a smattering of programs up through the secondary schools. And as Zach said, quite a bit of the evidence base for DI is on those programs, including project follow-through.
Kurt, since you just used the S word, scripting. So let's take this opportunity to address what I suspect for a lot of people is the elephant in the room. Zach, I was going to ask you, maybe we'll get to it later. I mean, I'm curious to know how we did get so far away from this idea that teachers should teach explicitly, because listening to you, it just sounds so obvious. But I'm going to make a guess here as somebody who does not have experience with DI, big or small letter DI, that if teachers object to this, it's because of what they perceive to be, oh, you want me to be a robot, a McTeacher. You're scripting me, right? Whoever wants to address that, I'd love to hear your take on teaching with a script and the misconceptions that may be associated with it. Zach, you want to take that?
Sure. So I'll just say that I was tasked just in the last couple of years of teaching some of the the most challenging students to teach, often the kids that were sort of kicked out of class the most frequently, the kids who teachers have given up on because of attendance and all other sorts of things. And what I did was I asked, what materials do they have for me? I am busy coaching teachers. I am busy running after school things. I have my own kids, right? What materials do you have? And no one could give me any answers. They, well, just figure it out. Just look on Google it, right? And and I opened up some cupboards and I found a program called Corrective Mathematics, which is a capital DI program, and I started using it. And the thing is that's after me teaching for 10 years, being in education for 14 years, getting a PhD, right? And I needed something to guide how to teach middle schoolers who have been failing at math their entire and hating math for their entire school careers. And I got this, and it no joke, it really opened up a lot of opportunities for me. It led to me requesting training from Nifty and to become a better direct instruction teacher. It led to very quickly the kids finding that 1 hour with me was the most enjoyable and successful part of their whole day. The script is just like acting like an actor. You preview everything that's for the lesson. There's not all this extra stuff and bells and whistles. You have what you need to say and what you need the kids to do. And you preview it, you practice it to an empty room, and you do some stuff that we've talked about in this presentation, and the kids get to 100% mastery in the lesson. It feels like magic. And that's the confusing thing, is that when people, get all mad about the scripts, I want to say, like, I just want them to come in with me or with another teacher with even more experience with these and just try it and see it, and you will feel the difference.
Kurt, Patrice, if you want to weigh in as well, because I think my sense is that teachers view the script as, you don't trust me to make my own and to make my own materials. You don't trust me as an expert. You're putting words in my mouth. But my sense from Zach and others is, and Marcy Stein, who he invoked earlier, that's not what DI teaching is all about.
Well, definitely it has to do with the familiarity of the teachers with the script and whether they get the training. You're right. We run into that quite a bit, of teachers who essentially are forced to use DI without having a proper explanation or demonstration. But I tell you, we also do run across a lot of teachers, professionals who are desperate, who want their students to succeed, who have seen their students fail year after year and not be able to access the books or understand the background, et cetera. So with those teachers, those are the schools quite a bit that will contact Nifty, those in which they really are committed to trying to figure out what to do, and they've tried other things that haven't. So I will say, once they try it with enough training and support and they see the success of the students, then there's a huge turnaround. And we can even see in a new implementation that, let's say, just starts in the fall, we can say, okay, by November 1st, we're going to have a lot of those people who are resistant going, oh my gosh, all my students are succeeding now.
Patrice, this conversation has obviously been oriented around practice for teachers and administrators, but I'm mindful that a lot of the AEI audience are say, policymakers or school board members or whatnot. So the evidence for direct instruction has significance outside the classroom. I know we talked about this in our prep call. Can you address what from this conversation you think the takeaway should be for school board members, for policymakers, for folks who are not day-to-day classroom teachers or administrators?
Great question. Thank you. It is really important for school board members, for policymakers, for people who are not in the classroom to understand learning. I can't stress that enough. Too often in my over 25 years in the classroom, did I sit through professional development that was absolutely meaningless, based on the latest shiny object. And as school board members, when when the district is paying out a lot of money, they need to be aware of what the money is going for. And is it, somebody saw something somewhere and so that's what it's going to be? Or is it going to be based on evidence? I was very fortunate to work for UNESCO, which worked on an assessment for world education by the year 2030. And out of the less than 5 findings, one was that education must be evidence-based. And I think that is super important for policymakers, for school board members, for administrators, for parents. Parents are, I call it the teaching triangle. They are people who we can collaborate with about learning, and they are a vital part, especially for the younger grades. So the key to all is making sure that what goes into schools is indeed evidence-based, not wasting money, not wasting time, but truly making a difference in how kids will learn.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, Patrice. But let's go back. I don't mean literally to the slide that Zach showed, I think, to start the presentation, where he showed Project Follow Through, and everybody saw it. The results from Project Follow Through, and then the more fashionable ideas that we have about what teaching and learning looks like just failed to deliver the results. How can we have a field that is just so blithely unaware of this? And I mean that literally. I mean, you mentioned Project Follow Through to folks in our world, and you get a blank stare. They've just never heard of it. How did we get to that point?
That is $1 million question. I think too much time has been spent on those shiny new objects. For example, how often does the myth of learning styles permeate so many places when there is absolutely no evidence that backs it up? And so I think, like 25, 30 years ago, this information wasn't known. But with people like Kurt and Zach and Research Ed and people who are building these powerful communities where evidence makes a difference. And for you to have something like this available helps get the word out that we absolutely know how students learn right now. We know it, and we can get it into schools. We can do it. We know how, but we have to have the school board. We have to have teachers. We have to have administrators. We have to have people who take the switch from, oh, well, I did fine, and I would just reread my notes to study for a test, that we know better now. So it is getting the word out, making sure that evidence is cited, and helping teachers understand how we learn.
You didn't weigh in on the scripting question, Patrice, but I'll ask you now, because this is my gut, my intuition, but I've got no evidence for it. I suspect that when it has to do with that issue of scripting, for example, or even if it comes down to what Zach talked about before, economy of language, being very judicious about the words we use, that can land, right? To some ears is, oh, well, you're diminishing teacher professionalism. You're diminishing their art.
Capital D, capital I was not used in my school district. And to be honest, I was working so closely with cognitive scientists throughout. So we were always looking at evidence, but part of that absolutely was direct instruction. But again, following it up with teaching, and Kurt, I liked what you said about teaching 10 to 15%. That's really important. And then retrieving, being able to pull information out. I think of teachers as being these wonderful choreographers of a learning dance, and taking that 10 to 15% and weaving into what they already knew, bringing forth the new information, having enough strategies in your back pocket that you can have your students retrieve, that you know how to space it out to take advantage of the forgetting curve, creating interleaving and critical thinking, and always making sure that students have tools to understand if they know it or if they still need work on it. So I think these are all, the three of us putting our information together is what we need to get out to board members and policymakers and teachers and parents.
Go ahead, Kurt.
If I could just weigh in here, I agree with everything you've said, Patrice. There's one set of actors, though, we haven't mentioned, and I think they may be the most critical.
The students?
Are you going to say
teacher preparation colleges?
Oh, yes.
Teacher preparation colleges, it's indoctrination at so many of it. There's a wide variety, but they don't teach evidence-based practices. And so what happens with NIFTY? So when we contract with a school or district, we normally have almost no one who knows even about small DI or explicit instruction. Maybe some do, much less big DI. So we have to start at the beginning of what is modeling, leading, testing, different types of error correction, et cetera. It's starting at ground zero. But there is overall a very huge bias against direct and explicit instruction, especially capital DI.
I want to leave time. Go ahead.
Oh, I think me and Kurt and some folks at Nifty talked about this before the call. It was like we called this talk reviving. We started with reviving, and I think depending on who you talk to, some people have to ask, was it even alive to begin with, right? Right? It is true, and such vast disparities between the schools that I visit in terms of their commitment to the teacher leading the learning and knowing the science behind it, and the schools that are just, maybe they're making a switch, or maybe I came in and they didn't even expect me to come out guns a-blazing about this topic, and now they're just for the first time considering the possibilities with a direct and explicit approach.
Okay. I'm listening to this conversation, and I'm thinking of Emily Hanford's podcasts, Sold a Story and Hard Words. And again, since I was schooled in so many of the instructional methods that she kind of unwound in her work, I can steelman a case for them. In other words, it makes sense to me why we would have led ourselves so badly astray with reading instruction, because some of the practices that we now understand are substandard are, as I like to say, intuitive, obvious, sexy, and wrong. Right. But let's not gloss over the intuitive, obvious, and sexy part. They're fun to teach this way. And of course, kids are going to learn to read if we fill them with a love of reading and stories that they're intrigued by, et cetera, et cetera. It just doesn't work. I'm not seeing that case with direct instruction. I mean, I joked about it earlier, Zach, saying, when did we get this idea that teaching, when did we get this idea as teachers that teaching is bad? But that's kind of what we're doing here, right? Like somehow we have persuaded ourselves as a field. I love the title of your book, Just Tell Them. How did we get to the idea that that's not what we should be doing? It seems obvious.
And, and teachers want to do right by students, right? And so when they get somebody who's making their evaluation rounds, telling them, hey, I want you to minimize your talk. Attention is about 15 seconds, the span of a goldfish. Make sure you cater to their learning styles. Oh, you don't want to drill and kill. That will kill learning, right? You get someone telling you that and feeding that to you. You're going to make a choice that is going to balance what works and what you've seen work with your professional obligation to your school. And I would persuade schools to just just take a look at at this type of evidence. Take a, rewind this presentation, and really you can empower your teachers by giving them the news. Guess what? You're valuable. You know stuff. You're an expert, and bring it to them just like you do with your own kids at home, right? Bring it to the kids personally.
I do want to caution about one thing that, and this relates to some people say, well, make it explicit, make it systematic. I mean, in general, Zach, you know that I'm on the same page as you are. But there also needs to be a content analysis. And in my summary of what's the big difference between capital DI and small di, I didn't mention that. And part of that content analysis comes out in the field tryouts where you try things and, oh my gosh, you didn't know that kids would get confused by that. If I could just tell a quick anecdote or two. There's a teacher in Texas that my father used to work with. My father is the senior author of all the DI program, capital DI programs. And she was doing explicit systematic, teaching those kids to count 2, 3. And they would follow, she would do 1, 2, 3, they'd count 1, 2, 3, and they would do different things, come back to it, count to 3, and they would go 1, 2, 3. They had it. So then she asked them, count to 5. And you know what some of the kids did? They said 1, 2, 5. So you see that example set was so stipulated, kids logically, they thought counting was to say 1, then 2, then whatever your end number is. Count to 12, 1, 2, 12. So it's consistent with that presentation. The other example I'll give, and it's super common, is presenting the letters in the alphabetical order. So this is the first time many kids have encountered symbols. And what's the order that they're presented? A, B, C, D. Well, the B and the D, if you're just used to objects, look like the same thing turned around, right? And so a lot of them get confused. That's why in the Reading Mastery program, they're separated by more than 100 lessons being introduced. And by the time they've seen both of them, they don't get confused. So I just want to throw in content analysis in there, not simply being systematic and explicit, which are prerequisites, but sometimes not sufficient.
Thank you. We're coming up close to time. I want to be respectful of our viewers' time. But if we have to go for a minute or two long, I just want to get your quick takes on one or two questions that have come in from our viewers. One, I think, maybe gets to one of the other perceived objections to direct instruction or explicit instruction, which is student engagement. So the question is, what does the recent research about student engagement say about student engagement under direct instruction? Or to simplify, is there anything to this idea that, oh, well, this is just boring and this is not engaging for kids? As a teacher, I know what my kids are interested in. I don't want a script. I want to be able to tailor my instruction to them. Zach, you want to have a bash at that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just plug what Patrice has done just for a sec, right? As a master teacher, right? You could look at each of the things she implemented in her class. For example, short cycle quizzes, starting the lesson off with quiz, some note taking or retrieval taking, where she has everyone cover up the notes and have a discussion or retrieve. These type of things like note taking, drills, quizzes, right? They're so boring. But you attend a class where kids are set up for success, and you realize that we may have the direction of the arrow between motivation and success in the wrong order. We typically think if I just motivate them, they will be engaged and they will try harder and learn more. Where I think we need to reconsider that idea. We need to think about, first of all, it's bi-directional, these two things, but we need to mainly think about what can we do? We can control the instructional design of our classrooms so that kids get early successes, and then success breeds success in a virtuous cycle. And that's what you see when you go to a direct instruction classroom, is you see everyone leaning forward, everyone knowing the answers, everyone going to lunch and going home and telling their parents about all the stuff they learned, right? Because they are just armed with powerful knowledge as a result of this type of teaching.
Perfect. I want to ask as we conclude for my colleague Riley Fletcher to put up a slide for those who have listened to this and are intrigued by this and might like to see it in action. We've got courtesy of NIFTY, a collection of schools that do teach direct instruction, that if you're intrigued to see this model in action, then you might, these are some contact folks or contact email addresses at various schools across the country where you might have the opportunity to do your own professional development and go see direct instruction live and in person. Wow, this has just been an invigorating hour and 15 minutes. I cannot thank Zach, Patrice, and Kurt enough. When we were preparing for this, Kurt said, well, this is an entire college class. We're not going to be able to cover this in 75 minutes. And he's right. So don't be surprised if we get the band back together, so to speak, for a deeper dive sometime in the future. But for now, Kurt, Patrice, and Zach, thank you for this terrific, it's been a terrific presentation, time well spent. And to our AEI audience, we will see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.